Hi, welcome to another episode of Out of Psych, Out of Sound, the podcast for A-level psychology students. This week, I'd like to look at the different types of experiments that exist. This episode isn't going to examine the strengths and limitations of each experimental method. It's just simply going to go through what makes up each experimental form. So experiments are a method that psychologists use when they want to establish a cause and effect relationship. You'll sometimes hear that being referred to as causality. It's the same thing. But this means that they have to have at least one independent variable, and that can be broken down into conditions. It's at least two conditions. And they'll also have at least one dependent variable. And the dependent variable has to be numerical because they're going to observe if they change. So first and foremost, all experiments, like I've just said, have to have an IV and a DV. And that doesn't matter which experimental method we're looking at, they all have to have those. But then there are actually four types of experiments that a researcher can choose between: a lab, field, natural, and quasi. And it'll come down to, whatever suits their needs as to which form they'll adopt. A lab experiment is conducted in a controlled environment, and it requires the researcher to be able to manipulate the conditions of the IV. So that means, when I say manipulate the conditions of the IV, it means that the researcher is in charge of altering the conditions, such as if I was interested in looking at whether caffeine affects reaction times, the researcher, if it was a lab experiment, would conduct it in a controlled environment, but they would manipulate, they would be in charge of the level of caffeine that participants are exposed to. Now, a field experiment also insists on the researcher being able to manipulate the conditions of the IV, but this time it's carried out in a field setting. And the field setting is simply a natural setting for the particular task, that's involved within the experiment. So the kind of places field experiments are usually set are, for instance, settings like busy city streets, in New York, in a hospital or in a school, etc. And then we move on to natural and quasi experiments. These are probably the hardest for students to get their head around. In theory, natural and quasi experiments can be carried out in a laboratory or a field setting. What makes them natural or quasi is actually down to the independent variable. So with a natural experiment, the researcher cannot manipulate the conditions of the IV. They happen naturally, hence why it's called a natural experiment, such as measuring people's stress levels before and after a natural disaster, or looking at emotional development before or after adoption. The researcher hasn't intervened, they didn't set up the conditions to change, they were going to happen anyway. And then there's quasi experiments, good old quasi, or quasi, some people call them. For a start, the word quasi means almost but not really. So you can see instantly that many people don't even view this as a true form of experimental method. And that's because the conditions of the IV already exist. So they pre-exist. You're looking at independent variables such as gender, age, sexuality, mental health condition, developmental condition, genetic relatedness, etc. These are things, the conditions of these IVs are things that already exist out there in society within humans. And these researchers will just go and take advantage of those occurring and study them. Okay, so that makes up quasi experiment when the conditions of the IV already exist out there. So hopefully that has cleared up the difference between the four types of experimental method. But thank you for listening to this episode of Out of Psych, Out of Sound.